Our next guest is the newly appointed president and CEO of the Toronto Foundation, and no stranger to the not-for-profit world or the institutions that work alongside the corporate and public sectors to make this city strong, livable, and equitable for all its citizens. Over the last 19 years, Sharon Avery has been a high-energy fundraiser and civic leader, serving for 8 years as Chief Development Officer at UNICEF Canada and holding senior positions at Sick Kids Hospital Foundation, Save the Children Canada, and Tim Hortons Children's Foundation.
We're delighted to have Sharon with us tonight to talk about the Toronto Foundation and the results of its annual Vital Signs report that tracks our city's health and well-being across a number of indicators. Sharon, welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
And let's start by reminding our audience that your predecessor in this role was the highly regarded and high-profile Rahul Bhardwaj, who twice appeared on Toronto Files to talk about the Vital Signs report. So we're happy to make this an annual event on our show. But let me ask, has it been at all daunting to be filling Rahul's shoes and step in to basically take the lead on the Vital Signs report this year?
Well, absolutely, but I would say also, having seen Rahul speak at last year's Vital Signs, it also made me enthusiastic about the opportunity. You know, he is such a passionate city builder, and hearing him made me realize and ask myself, is that something I could ever do myself? So I find him an inspiration. He's done incredible work for the city and for the foundation the last 10 years. So it's really an honor to take on the role and see what I can do with it.
Well said.
Yeah, very and well done. So before we launch into the Vital Signs report itself and what it shows, let's talk a little bit about your career. You've had some indication was given to, in the introduction, but let's talk about your work with UNICEF and other organizations focused on investing in children, maternal health, and supporting women in an international context. What's the fit, or is it a logical one for you to go now to the Toronto Foundation?
Well, it's been an interesting journey for me. Taking this job, I had a lot of questions from people, like going from UNICEF to a Toronto-focused organization. My career has always been about serving the most vulnerable. You know, I grew up in a middle-class environment, and my very first experience with economically disadvantaged kids was through the Tim Hortons Children's Foundation. And I had never suffered. I had never been without a meal. I had never been, you know, and I would see these things, and it really changed my whole perspective on what I wanted to do and be with my life. So that has been my pathway. The connection with UNICEF and my experiences at Sick Kids, in terms of Sick Kids for me was understanding the city and understanding the kind of work that really incredible philanthropy can do and the change it can make. With UNICEF, it was a big global perspective, but on some of the biggest issues we're tackling here, things like poverty, things like equality and equity, things like empowering girls. All of these things are as relevant here in Toronto as they would be in Dakar or in Aleppo or in anywhere that we're seeing in the news right now. So that's really when I saw the opportunity to be doing all that in my own city in a way that could affect the lives of my own children, I thought it's a great opportunity. And then you add, you know, Rahul's reputation and the credibility he's built, and it was a no-brainer.
He's built a great foundation. Actually, tell us a little bit about the foundation itself and its mission. As I understand it, the foundation exists to almost like the United Way, in a sense, in that you pool philanthropic dollars and facilitate charitable donations for community causes. Is that a fair description?
It is. I would say that you know, what we have in common with United Way is a similar passion for helping make it a more equitable city. The model in which we do it is a little bit different, and so we have a large endowment fund, $411 million endowment that is there to serve philanthropy and serve the city. So first and foremost, people come to us often to set up up their own foundations. We provide back-end services. You heard in the news recently, Gord Downey has established a foundation. Well, he established that foundation with us. And so we're a turnkey in place for philanthropists to come and really enhance the philanthropy they're already doing. You build on that, this other exciting piece, which is the city building piece, and our discretionary money that we would distribute throughout the city in the way of grants to support city building. But that's only one portion of the larger purpose of community foundations. There's 191 of us across Canada. We exist to facilitate and enhance philanthropy as a whole.
Sure.
Okay, so now let's turn to the Vital Signs report. And this is the 15th year that the Vital Signs report is out. Is that correct? Yes. So let's take the macro view first and say, over those years of reporting on Toronto's health and well-being on a number of different indicators, how has Toronto changed overall? Can you do some top-line analysis of what that looks like?
If you'll allow me just to say one more thing about why Vital Signs, and it builds on the question of why the foundation.
Sure.
You know, the fact is that as a community foundation back in 2001, we realized that no one was looking at the whole city at once. There was lots going on in the way of research, lots going on in very narrow pillars. And so someone smarter than me said, why don't we actually be a convener of research?
Aggregate all of that
Aggregate it all into one place.
Right.
And that's really where Vital Signs came from.
And has it been doing that since the beginning?
We
Vital
have,
Signs?
and
But
we
you've
were
been
the
adding
first.
categories too.
Adding categories, getting better at it. This year, to your question, we added global data. And partly is because I asked the question. You know, I come in from a global perspective. Toronto is a world-class city. What is the global data? How can we be comparing ourselves across the world? So on that front, we do very well. You know, we are the 5th most livable city in the world. We are the 6th or 7th most prosperous city in the world. So on a global scale, we look really, really good. Our educational post-secondary achievement is 60%. I mean, we really are a very strong city in many ways. But when you look over 15 years, there are some things that have persisted. My favorite one to talk about, of course, is child poverty. 20 years, and that poverty rate has barely moved, and if it's moved, it's gotten worse. So in some of our neighborhoods in this city, our child poverty rate is as high as 37%.
And how does that compare globally?
Well, so this is my big soapbox. The fact is that most people don't realize globally, we've reduced poverty in the world by 50% in the last 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
That's so counterintuitive too.
Yeah.
It really is. And so when I come into this job and I see that child poverty in this city hasn't moved in 20 years, I think, well, it's totally possible to move it. What do we need to do? You know, how do we need to get more people involved in the issue?
Okay.
And
So-
do you make recommendations on that score, or do you just simply report the findings?
Well, I would say that my perspective is if you're going to report on data, then you need to take a stand on a few items. And this one for me is a big one. But I see poverty as very much connected. So some of our other key statistics are things like last year, the shift in, well, we all talk about affordable housing a lot in this city. It's 85,000 people on the wait list. But last year, year over year, we housed 18% fewer off the wait list. And so these are the things that we highlight to say, how can philanthropy begin to step into some of these issues? We want people to see where things are working, but we also want to show people where things aren't moving at all, and maybe they need to turn their attention to them.
Speaking of not moving at all, one of the recurring issues that keeps emerging and it seems worsening is our traffic congestion in this city. And what is the Vital Signs verdict on how we're doing when it comes to transit and simply moving people in cars or whatever form of vehicle they're in? Are we getting worse, or does it just seem like that?
No, we're definitely getting worse, and I wish I could tell you something different. Although I'm heartened to hear the level of conversation that's now happening at 3 levels of government right now about that investment. In fact, one of the things I was really thrilled to see a couple weeks ago was the Board of Trade piece of research on the number of jobs that are going to be created by infrastructure investment over the next 10, 15 years. And I think that's a great example. Youth unemployment in this city has been terrible for the last 15 years, but last year we actually saw it drop by 5%. And we
Is
say
that the first time we've seen it drop in a while?
First time in a decade.
Oh.
And so it's gone from 20% to 15%. And we ask ourselves, is that just a blip? Are we going to see that get worse again next year, or is there an opportunity to build on strength? Because at the same time last year, our global data shows that Toronto was named the urban region with the most opportunities for youth. So you put that together with some of the great research the Board of Trade has done on the jobs that are coming, and I say to myself, what could we be doing to be funneling more youth towards the trades? They have 147,000 jobs coming in the next 10 years. And so where I think vital signs and research is very useful for philanthropy and for action is it actually pinpoints with real data the smart decisions you can be making to where should I be looking to invest? Where could I have the most impact?
Sharon, one of the things that makes Toronto a great city and has made Toronto a great city for 70 years is the extent to which we've welcomed newcomers. But while we welcome them, are we doing enough for them once they get here? How are we doing in terms of engaging them, in terms of providing the services they need and the employment that they want? Are we doing well on that score, or are we just literally letting them come in and find their own way?
Well, there's no question that I was talking about youth unemployment. Newcomer youth unemployment have a much higher unemployment rate. It's something in the neighborhood of 60% compared to the average Torontonian. And so that's an issue I think worth looking at. One of the things, the Toronto Foundation is actually the host of the Welcome Syria Fund, so we're sort of deep into really welcoming our refugee families into the city. But I think that the other statistic that's really powerful is, in fact, our percentage of our population that is newcomer is dropping, which is just interesting because we've always prided ourselves in being the most diverse city in the country, one of the most diverse in the world. And so I think there's a number of things at play there. One of the stats you'll see is that the security-wise, Torontonians as a whole feel fairly safe. It's something like 80% feel comfortable walking the streets at night. But the incidents against the Muslim population have gone up. And so I think that I would highlight that as an area we need to dig more into to understand, because it's not a long-term trend. We're seeing it as something much more recent, but for that reason, can we catch things early and get more involved in that issue?
Sure. Let's hope it's not a long-term trend.
Right,
Yes.
right. So let's turn now to the economy and how we're faring there. It sounds like a bit of a mixed bag from what I can see in vital signs. What did the report find in terms of the growing gap between rich and poor, for instance, in the city, and also in terms of employment? Is there also cause for concern there?
Well, as I said, youth employment is doing well.
Right.
Overall employment, we're back to pre-2008 standards, so I would call that in today's economy a good news story. However, I think that the city as a whole isn't equitable. And when we talk about that big word equity, what do we mean? The fact is that if you look at our broad averages, we look really good and we could celebrate. And I think I don't want to be seen to be the person who's not celebrating the greatness of the city, because I'm its biggest advocate. However, when we slice the neighborhoods of the city up, so for example, we have of the 15 poorest ridings in the country, 5 of them are here. And when you actually just look in those neighborhoods, all the statistics are completely different. In fact, they're almost the opposite of everywhere else in the city. And so when I talk about what I would dream Toronto to be as a great city, I dream of it being a more equitable city where everyone has an opportunity. We talk about this gap between rich and poor a lot, and I also talk about philanthropy. And one of the things that's really awkward about that gap growing is that I think it makes the wealthy feel guilty. Because when we say that it's growing, it suggests that we're suggesting they take less and give everything to the poor.
But does it stimulate them to be more philanthropic,
Well,
perhaps?
and maybe, but what I'm really talking about is lifting the poor up to meet my husband would say, bring the ceiling, or bring the floor up.
Yeah.
And that's when a city is truly great and it's truly working well, transit-wise, infrastructure-wise, it's truly great because there is more equity in the city. The smaller the gap, the happiness quotients, the security numbers, the budgets, everything is better in terms of pulling people out of poverty. But the stats are shocking. You know, I mentioned that 18% fewer people made it off the wait list for affordable housing this year. We saw enormous shift in food bank use and the poverty shifting from downtown core to the inner suburbs, sort of Etobicoke, North York, Scarborough, as you know, increased use as high as 48% of some of those populations using food banks, and a huge increase in seniors using food banks. So a lot of time I think people look and say, well, they just need to get a job. Well, a lot of these folks are retiring. You know, they're retired, they worked their whole
It's actually
life.
good for them for retiring to open up jobs for others who need to get them.
Right.
But also struggling to survive.
Sure.
And so I think that's the piece that, you know, when we look at our city, it will be truly great when it's a more equal city. And it doesn't mean anyone has to lose. It means that we need to help others to gain.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Sharon.
My pleasure. Thank you
Thanks
so
for
much.
being here.
Yeah, and we'll be back with more Toronto Files after this short break.